There's a subtle kind of discouragement that often slips into our lives quietly, without fanfare or dramatic signs. It doesn't announce itself like a crisis. It doesn't rattle the walls or come with obvious pain or collapse. Instead, it creeps in softly after long periods of faithful effort. After many prayers that weren't exactly wasted, but also didn't seem answered in the ways you hoped. After countless days of choosing what's right, returning to Scripture, striving to keep your heart pure, resisting drift, avoiding giving up, yet still feeling like life's surface remains mostly unchanged. In those moments, the temptation is subtle. It's not always the urge to stop believing outright. Sometimes it's simply doubting whether your faith is doing anything real at all. Let's be honest. We often expect growth to be visible. We expect faith to come with clear movement, emotional confirmation, or a sense that something is happening. When those feelings don't arrive, silence begins to feel suspicious, like distance. It feels as if you might be stuck in a place where you were meant to be moving forward. But here's a thought I want you to hold with care. What if the faith that seems least impressive is sometimes the very faith doing the deepest work? Not the faith that appears strong when others watch. Not the faith that sounds beautiful in conversation. Not the faith that performs certainty perfectly. Rather, the faith that keeps choosing God in plain, repetitive, unseen ways. The faith that returns faithfully, even when there's no dramatic news to share. The faith that remains steady in the dark, without demanding immediate proof that the darkness will end. Scripture seems far more interested in this kind of faith than we often are. Maybe that's because God measures depth differently than we do. We tend to measure by what's visible. God seems to measure by endurance. We tend to count outcomes. God cares deeply about formation. We ask if faith is producing visible change around us. God focuses on whether faith is quietly reshaping what's happening inside us. And that difference, it changes everything. Or at least it should. Let me say this slowly, because this kind of faith is easy to overlook precisely because it doesn't know how to promote itself. From the outside, it doesn't always appear deeply spiritual. It rarely produces the kind of language people admire. It doesn't raise its voice or seek applause. Actually, some of the most significant movements of faith unfold in painfully ordinary ways. They might look like choosing gentleness in a conversation when sharp words would be easier. They can appear as doing honest work in front of you, even when cutting corners would be simpler and unnoticed. They might be getting up on a weary morning and praying, expecting no emotional reward. They look like holding back bitterness, even when it seems justified, or continuing to fulfill responsibilities that feel meaningless, not out of excitement, but out of a commitment to faithfulness. None of these moments make for dramatic testimonies at the time. None create stories people immediately call powerful. But perhaps that's exactly why we tend to underestimate them. We've trained ourselves to associate power with spectacle. Yet Scripture frequently links power with perseverance. We tend to crave sudden, explosive moments, but the Bible honors the long, enduring stories. This might explain why many believers feel confused during quiet seasons. They assume real faith would be easier to spot. But what if one sign of mature faith is that it becomes harder to showcase and easier simply to live? The Psalms vividly reveal the tension within faith. When you pause to truly listen, many of these prayers don't sound like the polished triumphs we expect for mature belief. Instead, they feel strained and raw, as if written by people desperately holding on to God amid real pressure. Historically, many psalms were born out of fear, displacement, conflict, instability, waiting, and sorrow. These were turbulent times, seasons where certainty was scarce and safety precarious. Yet despite this, we don't find spiritual silence or disappearance. We find prayers that persist even when relief remains distant. Sometimes, these prayers resemble protests more than praises. They are strikingly honest, pushing the boundaries of conventional religious expression. The psalmist openly asks how long, why, and where God is. Crucially, though, the dialogue never ceases. The speaker stays turned toward God, wrestling to understand, yet refusing to let go. This detail matters deeply because it suggests that faith isn't always shown through emotional steadiness. Often, it shines through persistent relationship. The prayers may be rough around the edges, but they are still prayers. The heart may be unsettled, but it remains aimed at the Lord. Perhaps one of our biggest mistakes is believing faith must always feel composed to be genuine. Scripture doesn't assume this. Across its pages, faith isn't the absence of inner struggle, but the refusal to stop bringing that struggle before God. The wilderness teaches us a profound lesson, though it is far from comfortable. In modern Christian thought, the wilderness often gets reduced to a poetic symbol, but in the biblical context, it was so much more. It was dangerous, barren, and unrelenting. The wilderness stripped people bare, exposing them completely. There was no place to hide a need for others or for God. No conveniences, no comforts, no illusions of independence allowed. The reason Scripture repeatedly returns to the wilderness may be because it forces faith out of the realm of beauty or drama and into something practical and daily. It demands survival-level trust, just one more step, one more morning, one more act of obedience, one more refusal to cling to past comfort. There's no spectacle here. Drama doesn't serve the purpose. Instead, formation is at the heart of this experience. Faith that emerges in the wilderness shows itself only when options narrow and dependence becomes undeniable. This kind of faith doesn't often feel inspiring in the moment. It feels plain, exposed, even stripped of spiritual romance. Yet, perhaps this rawness is where something real begins. Applying this to everyday life, the wilderness may resemble periods where old struggles reoccur without change. The same obligations linger in questions, temptations to grow resentful over slow progress. In such times, faith looks less like a powerful event and more like the steady choice to remain true. Choosing not to lie, not to harden your heart, not to seek retaliation, and not to let confusion dictate your moral decisions. These choices don't feel grand or dramatic, but maybe grandeur isn't what God desires in faith. Let me share a confession that might bring some clarity. I've often believed that if my relationship with God were truly strong, I'd feel more certain, more peace, clearer direction, and a sense of forward momentum I could easily recognize. When I didn't experience these feelings, I quickly jumped to the conclusion that something was wrong. Perhaps I had missed God. Maybe I drifted away, or the silence I felt meant our connection was fading. However, when looking at Scripture, another perspective emerges. It suggests that sometimes silence isn't a sign of God's absence at all. In fact, it could signal a deeper presence, not the kind that thrills you or provides words you can swiftly turn into a testimony, but the kind that anchors you quietly, without flattering or reassuring your emotions. This depth reduces your need for emotional confirmation, and that thought can be unsettling. Many of us crave immediate reassurance, wanting God to make things unmistakably clear. Yet Scripture appears more focused on helping us become deeply rooted over time, rather than offering quick comfort. These are very different goals. One calms anxiety in the moment, but the other builds a life resilient enough to endure anxiety without being controlled by it. If this holds true, then silence may not mark a cessation of God's work. Instead, it might be the very setting where some of His most profound and lasting work unfolds. Understanding how God communicates can be deeply challenging, especially when we see in Scripture that He often doesn't interrupt confusion in ways we expect. Take Elijah, for example. His story stands out because it breaks from the patterns many of us naturally anticipate. Picture Elijah arriving at a moment filled with fear, exhaustion, and intense pressure. He has faced confrontation, danger, and public spiritual battles. Given all this, you might expect God to reveal Himself dramatically through wind, earthquake, or fire, something impossible to overlook, a vivid proof of heaven's activity. Yet, the text intentionally removes God from each of these spectacular elements. God is not in the wind, not in the earthquake, not in the fire. Instead, what follows is often translated as a still small voice, or even more delicately as a thin silence. This is not just a poetic touch, it's the main point. In a world where divine power is commonly linked with grand, loud displays, this scene teaches us that God may reject our craving for spectacle to encourage a deeper kind of attentiveness. God doesn't have to compete with noise or shout to be present within the world. Sometimes He waits quietly until the clamor fades on its own. Sometimes God's presence is revealed only when our souls learn not to be controlled by the desire for louder signs. This truth can unsettle us because it suggests God's presence might be real long before it becomes obvious. What we call silence can actually be training ground for perception. The question might not always be why God isn't speaking more loudly. Sometimes we need to ask if we are quiet enough to hear how He speaks when He chooses not to perform. This hits very close to real life. You pray, yet the stress at your job remains. You ask for wisdom, but the family conflicts still feel tangled. You seek peace, though your mind races through the night. You wait for a clear answer, but nothing arrives with the certainty you expected. No sudden interruption. No instant breakthrough. No powerful insight that perfectly solves the problem. However, if you look closely, a different kind of change may begin. You catch yourself pausing before saying something you might regret. You sense a small conviction growing where once there was only impulse. You find a bit more patience, a little less panic, and an increased ability to stay present amid unchanged circumstances. This isn't dramatic or impressive to others, but it could be more spiritually meaningful than we often realize. I've frequently assumed that clarity would come quickly if I was on the right path. Yet the Bible doesn't always support that view. Scripture often shows that discernment develops in the very moments when certainty feels postponed. Perhaps that's the point. A loud, immediate answer can be mimicked without true depth. A quiet, subtle answer demands our full attention. It calls for patience. It asks us to remain in the room, to endure the discomfort of only partially understanding. So, here lies the tension the text leaves us with. If God doesn't always interrupt our noise right away, might faith be about more than just receiving clear instruction? Could it also be about growing in the ability to listen deeply and well? Let's delve into one of the most challenging aspects of faith, perhaps the one people least want to confront honestly. We tend to prefer a faith that offers quick fixes, that solves our problems outright. But the Bible often points to a different kind of faith, one that shapes us quietly, even when our circumstances stubbornly refuse to change. Take Israel's wandering in the wilderness as a prime example. Their years in the wilderness aren't depicted as a triumphant montage, but rather as a cycle of repetition, instability, and frustration. Profoundly human experiences. They walked, stopped, waited, complained, recalled the past incorrectly, hoped, resisted, and repeated this pattern time and again. Historically, this wasn't just a journey. It was a life defined by uncertainty. No permanent home, no straightforward timeline, no clear signs of progress. The biblical text suggests that the journey itself is significant. It's not just about reaching a destination, but about what happens during that slow, drawn-out stretch. The exposure inward, the deep formation within. What stands out is how unromantic the people's responses are. They often felt restless, sometimes ungrateful, occasionally nostalgic for the very bondage they had escaped, and even angry in ways that read more like accusation than devotion. Yet, despite all this, the biblical narrative does not exclude them from the category of a people still being led by God. This matters because it challenges our neat ideas about what mature faith looks like. Sometimes, mature faith isn't joyful or inspiring. Sometimes, it's weary but still committed to obedience. Sometimes mature faith is simply present, still turning toward God, refusing to revert to old masters, allowing frustration to exist without permitting it to become the ultimate authority. Let's gently bring this idea into our present reality. There are seasons in life when prayer doesn't seem to change the external circumstances around you. Your job might stay just as demanding, conflicts may remain unresolved, your body might still feel tired, and many questions linger without answers. Yet, almost without you noticing, your reactions begin to change. You find yourself exercising more restraint, pausing more often, and becoming increasingly aware of your own patterns before they dominate your behavior. This doesn't feel like a breakthrough by typical standards. Perhaps that's because we tend to reserve the term breakthrough only for visible, external changes. But Scripture invites us to see endurance as a sign of growth. Not because endurance is flashy or glamorous, but because it reveals something deeper and maybe more significant. It shows that the soul can remain aligned and faithful, even when comfort and reassurance are absent. It shows that you don't need to fully understand everything to stay true and faithful within a difficult situation. I have often measured growth by tangible outcomes, open doors, visible fruit, resolution, or relief. Yet, the Bible frequently judges growth by endurance, whether a person remains present to God, especially when life offers no applause or reward for doing so. One interpretation is that faith isn't always about preparing you for the next thing. Sometimes, it's about shaping you to live faithfully in the present reality, without insisting that the present moment change first. Let's dive deeper into a layer that's often overlooked: exhaustion. Real faith doesn't usually show up when your energy is at its peak. In fact, it often emerges only once that energy has been completely drained. We like to think of spiritual strength as vibrant, fresh, confident, emotionally ready, and motivated. But the Bible paints a different picture. True strength frequently appears not as bursts of high energy, but as ongoing obedience that persists long after initial enthusiasm fades. Take Moses, for example. The scriptures don't shy away from showing his fatigue. He's burdened for years, managing heavy responsibility amid complaints, misunderstandings, and ceaseless demands. He doesn't always have all the answers. He questions God, hesitates, and clearly feels weighed down. At times, he seems close to his breaking point. Yet, the Bible doesn't use this weariness as proof of weak faith. Instead, it reveals a deeper, tougher kind of faith, one that demands more than visible confidence. This faith means you keep coming back to God, even when your own energy won't carry you any further. Moses repeatedly returns to the tent, seeks guidance, and shoulders responsibilities he never tries to glamorize. This is crucial. Faith here isn't about feeling strong. It's about refusing to let go when every part of you wants to quit because you're weak. This plays out in our everyday lives in ways that might seem almost too simple to notice. You speak kindly, even when you're exhausted. You honor commitments when the joy has disappeared. You choose integrity, even when fatigue tempts you to cut corners. You keep praying even when your prayers feel plain and unadorned. These acts may not look heroic, but maybe heroism isn't really what this is about. Perhaps it's about dependability, steady, quiet, and ongoing. And that dependability shapes the soul far more deeply than fleeting bursts of passion ever could. I have had to come to terms more than once with the fact that I often confuse tiredness with failure. When I'm depleted, I automatically think something is wrong. But the scripture doesn't always draw that conclusion. Sometimes, exhaustion isn't a sign that you're distant from God. Sometimes it's actually proof that you've been faithfully obeying through a long, hard stretch where comfort was absent. This doesn't make every kind of exhaustion holy or good, but it challenges the simplistic idea that if you were truly aligned with God, life would always feel lighter. Faith doesn't always instantly lift the burdens you carry. Sometimes it teaches you how to bear them without letting them break you. And this kind of strength is different from the kind we usually ask for. We often ask for strength that feels triumphant, victorious. But Scripture often showcases strength that's honest, limited, and steady. Strength that knows when to kneel down, admit, I'm tired, and still refuse to walk away from what is right. Strength that goes on, not because emotions are full, but because it has quietly learned exactly where to return when those emotions run dry. As faith grows and matures, its relationship with being seen also transforms. In the early stages, visibility feels crucial. We crave confirmation, encouragement, and for our convictions to be noticed, perhaps even admired. This desire isn't necessarily hypocrisy. It's often just human nature. However, Scripture suggests a deeper stage where faith no longer depends on external response. Jesus touches on this when he discusses prayer, fasting, and generosity in a society where public displays of devotion could easily become a means of gaining status. The teaching isn't condemning visible faith outright, but rather pointing out the problem of dependence on recognition. If devotion needs to be witnessed to sustain itself, it is more fragile than we might think. Jesus introduces the idea of the hidden room, the private act, the Father who sees in secret. He emphasizes quiet obedience, quiet prayer, and quiet generosity. This isn't about turning public acts into performances to prove a point. It's about refocusing our motives. This concept can feel deeply unsettling because hidden faith receives almost no external feedback. No applause, no instant affirmation, no social proof that your obedience made a difference. Yet, perhaps this is why such faith develops deeper roots. It forces faith to find its fuel somewhere beyond human reaction. It must draw from conviction, love, reverence, and alignment rather than applause or judgment. This principle shows itself in very everyday actions, telling the truth when no one would catch you in a lie, letting go of a grudge no one even knows you hold, doing the right thing without an audience, refusing to explain yourself merely to protect your image. None of these acts seem dramatic, yet each builds inner steadiness, making faith less vulnerable to praise and less controlled by criticism. I have to be honest. I enjoy encouragement and understanding. There's nothing wrong with that. Still, Scripture gently asks a more challenging question. What happens to faith when validation disappears? Does it shrink away? Become resentful? Double down on effort? Or does it gradually free itself from the need to be constantly witnessed? Perhaps true resilience in faith comes precisely when it isn't powered by feedback, positive or negative, but when it chooses what is good because it's rooted in truth. This is a tougher kind of spiritual maturity than flashy displays of devotion. It's likely why hidden obedience matters so much. It trains a soul to be shaped by God rather than by visibility. The question remains, if no one ever commented on your faith again, no recognition, no affirmation, no sign that anyone noticed, would your faith still shape your choices the same way? There's a subtle, almost invisible moment in faith where it stops being a mere reaction and starts to take root. It's not marked by fireworks or dramatic endings, no neat conclusions or clear chapters closing. Instead, something within becomes more steadfast, more difficult to uproot. In Scripture, this stage isn't portrayed as a triumphant victory, but rather as grounding. And grounding, by nature, is neither flashy nor swift. It unfolds quietly, often emerging after disappointment, rather than before it. This pattern appears time and again in biblical stories. People pray earnestly yet continue to wait. They cling to hope even amid loss. They believe, but still face uncertainty that doesn't evaporate on command. Nevertheless, something shifts, not necessarily in their external circumstances, but in how they live through them. Early in faith, the focus tends to be on whether things will ultimately work out. But a deeper, more mature faith starts asking a different question. How does one live faithfully when clarity remains out of reach? This isn't cynicism. It's an even more demanding form of trust. It dismantles the bargaining mentality and loosens the grip of needing guarantees. It locates meaning not in controlling outcomes, but in responding with integrity. This transformation influences everyday choices. You stop replaying conversations all night, make decisions based on what's right, even without knowing the payoff. Rest when you must without feeling guilty, and act without waiting for absolute certainty first. This isn't passivity, it's maturity. Perhaps one of the toughest lessons to accept is that stability doesn't mean the absence of doubt. Rather, it's the refusal to let doubt dominate everything. Scripture openly accepts that unanswered questions can coexist with obedience. This suggests faith becomes unshakable, not when everything finally makes sense, but when your next step of faith no longer depends on complete understanding beforehand. As your journey continues, faith begins to transform not just your actions but your entire perspective. This is one of the most subtle and profound shifts you'll encounter. Faith evolves from being a simple set of commitments into a new way of seeing the world. The challenges stay the same, the people around you remain unchanged, and your everyday routine persists. Yet these familiar elements start to take on new meanings. The Gospels often allude to this kind of change. Jesus doesn't just resolve problems, he reframes them entirely. A seed turns into a glimpse of the kingdom. Delays become moments filled with insight. Simple acts turn into reflections of what's in the heart. A coin poses a deeper question, and bread offers a meaningful lesson. In the context of the first century, this style of teaching served not merely to instruct, but to reshape the imagination itself. It trained people to observe life with a different, more profound attention. Perhaps this is one of faith's deepest impacts, especially when outward circumstances remain unchanged. Faith shifts what your soul notices. Waiting ceases to be mere wasted time and reveals hidden truths. Frustration becomes a diagnostic tool. Everyday conversations take on moral weight. Delay becomes a revealing space where your motives surface. This transformation doesn't make life simpler, but it certainly makes it clearer. You begin to listen more carefully, and resists the temptation to rush to conclusions about others' intentions. You become aware of your own reactions before they control your responses. Faith then turns from seeking certainty to nurturing attentiveness, from craving control to embracing wisdom. I once expected faith to provide quick direction. Instead, at times, it offers discernment, not a clear path forward, but a call to pay attention, to stay awake, to observe what your soul longs for, to recognize what fears are amplifying, and to be wary of what bitterness tries to pull you into. This kind of awareness may not be dramatic, but it is deeply transformative. There's also a darker side to faith, a point where it stops producing something visibly new. At that stage, faith is simply about holding on to what's left. Scripture does not shy away from this kind of faith. Take Job, for instance, one of the most unsettling and honest examples. His story never fits into the tidy resolutions people often wish for. The explanations he receives don't satisfy him. His friends speak too much, yet offer little help. His suffering defies neat categories. And Job's faith doesn't appear polished or triumphant in any public way. Instead, he questions, grieves, protests, and refuses to accept shallow comfort. Yet crucially, he does not completely disengage from God. That detail holds deep importance. At this point, faith isn't about cheerfulness or agreeing with every experience, nor is it about maintaining emotional stability. It's about refusing to step away from the conversation. It means choosing to remain oriented towards God, even when the familiar language that once made faith feel easier has been stripped away. This kind of faith embodies a sobering honesty. It suggests that faith might become most authentic when it stops trying to look strong. When certainty fades, simple explanations fall apart, and all that remains is raw trust, or perhaps just a stubborn refusal to abandon the one you no longer understand. This kind of faith is present in real life too. It appears when plans collapse, yet you don't rush to replace them with false optimism. It shows itself when answers don't come, and you resist creating shallow meanings just to feel better. You still care deeply. You continue acting responsibly. You still come before God. But you stop forcing a resolution that hasn't arrived. That restraint isn't passivity. It's disciplined honesty. Perhaps this is why Scripture honors two kinds of faith: the faith that builds and the faith that holds. One pushes you outward, expanding your reach. The other grounds you inward, rooting you deeply. And though the second often seems less impressive, it quietly becomes more enduring. When faith quietly continues its work, something subtle but profound starts to happen within you. It doesn't declare itself with fanfare or a sudden breakthrough. Instead, it's like slowly rearranging furniture in a dimly lit room. You don't notice the changes at first, but one day, you realize the room's center has shifted. The things that once held your full attention no longer dominate your inner world. Fear might still appear, but it no longer controls every thought. Anger may flare up occasionally, but it doesn't take permanent residence. The constant drive to justify yourself, defend your position, win arguments, prove your worth, and control every outcome begins to lose its unquestioned grip. Scripture often describes this internal shift, not with words like intensity, but in terms of fruit, patience, self-control, steadiness, and quiet strength. These qualities aren't flashy or emotionally thrilling, but they make life more livable. They open the door for deeper love and make obedience sustainable over time. Perhaps one reason this growth goes unnoticed is because it doesn't match the kind of change we've been taught to expect. We look for highs, moments of spiritual elevation. Yet, sometimes God offers integration instead. We anticipate excitement, but he teaches emotional honesty. We crave sudden victories, but sometimes he builds a calm we couldn't have appreciated before because we were too reliant on intensity to trust anything more subdued. This stage might feel anticlimactic if we're not paying attention, even mistaken for spiritual dullness. But Scripture embraces a form of maturity that is quieter rather than louder, more grounded than animated, governed rather than showy. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly why this kind of growth endures. Faith goes beyond just the moment that shapes it. It's not merely a trust built for times of crisis, breakthrough, or transition. Instead, it's designed to remain steadfast even when seasons change and the visible reasons for hope grow faint. Scripture hints at this through lives that never fully see the fulfillment of what they trusted for. Many biblical figures exist in the space between promise and fulfillment, between beginning and final outcome, between seed and harvest. Their faith isn't proven by holding the result in their hands. Rather, it's proven by their unwavering commitment as the story continues beyond their time. This can be tough for people like us who crave closure. We want clear results we can point to, neatly closed loops, and immediate evidence. Yet, Scripture often leaves stories deliberately open. It implies that some types of faith aren't measured by visible completion, but by steadfastness in truth. There's something both sobering and beautiful about faith that plants trees it may never sit under, that obeys without demanding instant proof, that dedicates itself to a future it may never fully enjoy. This reshapes how we define success. Success shifts from completion to contribution, from arrival to direction, from public recognition to faithful alignment with truth. In everyday life, it means you can invest in people without controlling outcomes, make costly choices without immediate applause, and live in a way that may only fully make sense later, perhaps even to someone else. This is not a fragile faith. It may well be one of the most mature forms possible. Finally, let's confront the most unexpected perspective of all. The kind of faith that truly changes the world might not appear revolutionary while it's unfolding. This challenges how we typically think of impact. We picture grand scale, widespread visibility, powerful movements, and well-deserved recognition. Yet, Scripture often ends its stories differently. It highlights quiet obedience, steadfast local faithfulness, unnoticed acts of love, and gradual transformations unfolding over time. Jesus himself embraces this imagery. Yeast working through dough, a tiny seed planted in soil, light that gently brightens without blinding. In the first century, these images weren't about conquest or domination. They represented permeation, slow influence, subtle interchange. This approach completely reshapes our understanding of impact. Faith changes how you approach words, power, time, money, conflict, desire, disappointment, and fatigue. It transforms how you treat those who can never repay kindness. It shapes how you stand for truth, even when no one acknowledges it. It influences decisions that no one will ever publicly link to belief. And that may be the very reason it's genuine, because this kind of faith isn't trying to prove itself. It simply does what faithfulness does. It permeates, reshapes, leavens, grounds, and sustains. I had to rethink this again and again. I used to believe that if faith was truly effective, its work would be unmistakable. But Scripture offers a different reading. The deepest transformations often start away from the spotlight. They stay hidden longer than we expect, reject spectacle, and earn trust before they show measurable results. Perhaps that's why quiet faith matters so deeply. It cares less about being seen in action and more about truly doing the work. If there's one common thread weaving through everything we've considered, it's this. Faith doesn't always announce its presence loudly, as it changes you. Sometimes it works quietly, gradually reshaping your endurance and influencing your choices. It teaches you to stay, not because it's easy, but because leaving feels harder. Faith grows calmer, steadier, and less dramatic, becoming more authentic over time. It doesn't always deliver emotional certainty, immediate rewards, or instant relief. Instead, it consistently leans toward what is good, what is right, and what is faithful. Perhaps that's why faith endures longer than fleeting excitement, why it persists through silence, and why it holds more weight than versions of faith craving constant, visible proof. So here's the reflection I want to leave with you, not as a tidy conclusion, but as a question worth carrying with you. If faith is meant to shape who you are becoming more than what you accomplish, how would that change the way you see your own journey right now? What if the growth you've overlooked because it felt too quiet is actually the kind of growth that will sustain you the longest? What if the prayers you thought went unnoticed were quietly training your heart? What if the simple, faithful actions you assumed no one saw have been building a steadiness that will matter more in the future than you can yet understand? And what if the faith you once doubted, tempted to call weak, is precisely what God has been using to mold you into someone durable, honest, gentle, attentive, and deeply rooted? If that's true, then silence isn't a sign of failure. It might just be the space where deeper transformations refuse to be rushed. If this reflection sticks with you, please leave a comment sharing which part lingered with you the longest. And if you want to continue exploring this quieter, more demanding, yet more lasting side of faith, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss what comes next. Because our next conversation starts exactly where this one leaves off, in that challenging but vital place where God might be working beyond what your feelings can yet express.